What conspiracy?
Heaven and hell working in secret consort to bring about the apocalypse earlier than anyone would wish for.
This is the Darksiders series. You've definitely played one of their main influences. Dreamed up by a tiny, unpaid team of friends, Darksiders was intended to have combat inspired by Devil May Cry, puzzles inspired by the Legend of Zelda series, and platforming inspired by Mario. This ambiguous goal would eventually evolve into a full-on franchise, but it's always been hobbled by the very thing that makes it special. Before we get into it, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Nerdstalgic Gaming for more videos just like this one. In 2005, comic book artist turned art director Joe Madureira, animator Marvin Donald, designer Ryan Stefanelli, and game director David Adams became Vigil Games. Together, these four horsemen of the apocalypse produced a demo that would eventually become the first Darksiders, but not before Vigil and their fledgling IP were bought up by THQ in 2006. From there, the team grew exponentially, and the true scale of their project finally started to become clear. As it turns out, creating a game that lives up to the expectations of DMC, Zelda, and Mario's influences is a big job, and Vigil Games had done virtually no pre-production. About 2 years of painstaking trial and error followed. Nothing seemed to be pinned down. The game's art style, story, and core gameplay were all flipped on their head at least once during the process, causing months of work to sometimes fall by the wayside. According to Gamementary's Darksiders doc, once the devs finished the Twilight Cathedral in Darksiders 1, they finally felt as though they had established what the game actually was, and what it was going to look like. Puzzles, combat, a fun traversal system, and a cartoony, gothic vibe. Just a horseman of the apocalypse, riding around New York-style subways, city streets, and creepy buildings. Finally, Vigil Games had a standard to hold to, and after a not insignificant amount of crunch, Darksiders was wrought upon the world January 5th, 2010. Despite the chaotic development, Darksiders was an unequivocal success. Critics and players were enamored with this brand new IP. On the surface, it may have seemed like a pretty standard hack-and-slash adventure, but taking a closer look revealed the truth. The game was made with passion, enthusiasm, and more than a little brash ignorance. Even though it borrowed heavily from the previously mentioned franchises, Darksiders proved itself with its stellar artistic direction, high level of polish on every front, and unique traversal system. The main character, War, lived up to his name as a formidable destructive force, and the story, though a little strung together, led players on an adventure punctuated by incredibly fun and memorable boss fights. In 1 month, Darksiders shipped over 1 million copies, but actually sold well under that. Despite positive reviews, the game just wasn't gaining any traction. Was this due to a lack of marketing, a general disinterest in the concept, or maybe it was Darksiders' unfortunate physical similarities to other upcoming war-centered games? We can't know for sure. We do know that the term God of War clone was definitely thrown at Darksiders in those early days, and it didn't help that the third God of War was scheduled to come out just 2 months after Darksiders. Still, since THQ was on the upswing financially thanks to the success of its other properties, they ordered a Darksiders sequel. In keeping with their manic, charmingly foolhardy development style, Vigil Games decided to throw out a huge portion of their work from the first Darksiders game for the sequel. How? By swapping out the main character and repositioning the gameplay to be on the edge of RPG territory. Why? Because they thought it'd be cool. Darksiders 2 featured the Horseman of Death as the anti-hero protagonist. The switch-up required an all-new character design, new movesets, new animations, and hours upon hours of development, gone with the lumbering, nightly attacks of war. Now, players were treated to an almost feral level of combat, fitting the lithe look of death. But the new main character was only the first change to contend with in the Darksiders sequel. The scope of the project was even bigger than the first. Every facet of Darksiders 1 was reviewed, reworked, and built on. The environments and creature designs took a hard turn into the fantastical as we left Earth in favor of other realms. There were more bosses, tons of puzzles, secret levels, and added RPG elements like randomized loot and branching dialogue trees. The story was tighter. Death felt more like a character than War ever did, and the gameplay was much more focused on exploration than its predecessor, with large overland areas filling out the game map. The feel of this game was similar to the first, and this worked for some players. Actually, this worked for most players. Darksiders and its sequel have very similar review scores. While critics preferred the first game, users were partial to the second. Either way, they were both good, solid titles. Maybe they weren't changing the trajectory of the game industry with innovative design, but Vigil Games made it clear that they were willing to try new things and expand the franchise. Sadly, they never got the chance. When it was released in 2012, Darksiders 2 struggled to break even in sales. Like the original, there just wasn't enough momentum behind the series for it to perform the way THQ needed it to. Only a few months after Darksiders 2 came out, THQ went bankrupt and became THQ Nordic. Vigil Games was closed down, and most of the team moved on to Crytek USA. 2 years later, the Darksiders IP was shifted over to Gunfire Games for development on a third installment. At the time, Gunfire was a brand new studio founded by David Adams. Remember David Adams? Darksiders' original game director? Yeah, so when most of Vigil Games transferred over to Crytek USA, their new place of employment turned out to be very short-lived. The studio shut its doors only a year after it opened, leaving all these ex-Vigil developers stranded. Some found other jobs at established companies, while others, like Adams, formed their own indie studios. Luckily for Adams and his team of 7 people, they managed to persuade the newly minted THQ Nordic to let them develop Darksiders 3, and they went to work immediately. Like Darksiders 2, the third game in the series switched up the gameplay quite a bit. While puzzles, bosses, and traversal system were still the main focus, it felt a little different. Playing as Fury, combat and overall gameplay was much more Souls-like in its approach. There was a great deal of importance put on leveling as well as enhanced weapons, and the map went from explorable overland areas with sectioned off dungeons to fully traversable open world. In just a few short years, Darksiders went from being called a God of War clone to a Dark Souls clone. And this time, people weren't happy. Upon release in 2018, Darksiders 3 suffered the worst reviews in the series, with critics complaining that the technical problems, monotonous combat, mindless puzzles, and a more nebulous lack of the original Darksiders vibes. It was the last complaint that really seemed to bother longtime fans. It was a big enough deal that the month of release, Gunfire put out a patch that added a classic mode to the game, which aimed to make combat feel more similar to the previous 2 installments. And it didn't help that the overall art style was clearly lacking the influence of Joe Mad. However, just because it wasn't necessarily a perfect Darksiders game doesn't mean it was terrible. For people who enjoyed Souls-like Metrovanias divorced from the IP, Darksiders 3 was a lot of fun, and its story was a series high point. Within a month and a half, sales on the game made back the money THQ Nordic spent on its development and marketing. Even with the less than favorable reviews, this was the first time the Darksiders series was ever a financial success. Some of this can be chalked up to Nordic's bigger marketing budget, and there's something to be said about the merit of the game as well. Of course, in 2019, another Darksiders game came out to a much warmer critical reception and still exceeded sales expectations, and it's worth investigating why. The Diablo-like spin-off, Darksiders Genesis, was created by Airship Syndicate Entertainment. Airship Syndicate, like Gunfire Games, is an indie studio founded by ex-Vigil developers. This time the names behind the studios are that of Joe Madureira and Ryan Stefanelli. Given that these two creative powerhouses were running the show, it's no surprise that Genesis actually felt like a Darksiders game, even though it's objectively the furthest thing from the series gameplay-wise. It's much more of a modest affair, with less money behind it, and yet the combat and puzzles rival that of the main games. Sure, Genesis is deeply and obviously paralleling the Diablo series, but that it manages to be still recognizable as a Darksiders game is commendable. With all this success, it stands to reason that we will eventually see a 4th Darksiders game in the main series, though it has yet to be confirmed. The problem is, given the history of the game so far, what it will look like and how it will play is totally up in the air. Darksiders started as a passion project for a handful of friends who had no idea what they were doing. They just wanted to make something inspired by their favorite games. Since then, the IP and developers themselves have been passed around to various studios, and Darksiders has never quite gotten out from under the shadow of its influences. Even at its best, Darksiders has always been compared to the franchises that inspired it, be they Zelda, God of War, Dark Souls, or Diablo. And perhaps that's why they've never managed to find a place among the greats. The series is imitating them instead of rivaling them. If Vigil hadn't been shut down in 2012, they may have gone on to create a new, truly unique Darksiders experience that broke its established mold in new and exciting ways. But instead, the series has been bound to its clone status for 3 games and a spin-off. But there's still time. Darksiders isn't dead, it's just dormant, and there's one more horseman the world needs to contend with. Let's just hope it's one with fresh ideas. Thanks for watching today's video, and if you like what you saw, please be sure to let us know by hitting the thumbs up and subscribing to Nerdstalgic Gaming for more. In the meantime, let us know in the comments, which is your favorite Darksiders game.